and we'll get started with our panel about how the Flash saved the comic book industry. Well, yes, he did.
Down in a small town in Texas known as San Antonio of 2.5 million people, very small town, there's a comic store called Nelco Comics. And the Nelco, of course, comes from comes from Phil Nelson over here, who's my boss and my friend most of the time. He's always my boss. He's always my friend. I'm just
Until
joking.
you drop my Hulk #1.
Yeah, I dropped his Hulk #1, and yeah, but it's okay. It hasn't been
But I love
damaged
you,
as
Bill.
far as we know. So don't Hulk smash. I run the store for Phil back in San Antonio. Well, about a year ago, I met this guy Mike Lights, and Mike starts telling me I'm a Flash fan. He's my #1 hero. Has been since I was a kid. And he went on and on and on about Flash. And so I finally realized, I'm just going to classify him in my head as a Flash expert. He actually is. He knows more about the Flash than anyone I know. And when he suggested this panel...
He doesn't know that many Flash fans.
Yeah.
I'm the only one who knows.
No, he's not the only one. We started coming up with panel ideas for this year. And he came up with how the Flash saved the comic book industry. And of course, my first knee-jerk reaction was, that's preposterous. And then 2 minutes later, I'm like, that's absolutely true. And I'd never really reflected on that or thought about that. So we started talking to Alex, and Alex and I have written a book together. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's Neal Adams, Master Illustrator. And thank you. Well, someone has, because we paid them. But Alex is an absolute master of comic arts, and he's written many books. But his main claim to fame. Put a shout out for your...
Understanding Superhero Comic Books. It goes into a lot of detail on actually some of the stuff we're talking about here, as well as before and after that stuff. But yeah, so I love this topic. When Michael and Bill talking about it, I was like, this is great, because it's so critical to like where superhero comic books became the viability of the industry and to be able to compete against TV using certain types of comics that could at the time. And Flash was it. So yeah, it's a near and dear topic.
Thank you, Alex. Next, we move on to Kevin Garcia. Kevin is one of the leading experts on Latino comics and comics involving Hispanics. He's also a wonderful writer in his own right, and he's an educator. And he's probably done about over 100 panels, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got 3 today, and I did like 4 or 5 last weekend, and yeah, I do a lot.
He wasn't even coming to the con until like less than a week ago. So who gets 3 panels in less than a week?
No, I seriously, this was going to be like the one San Diego Comic Con I was going to just skip for a year, and I was like, just next time. And last minute, I got 3 panels today, so there you go.
And next, the only man up here who really needs no introduction. I'm sure you've all heard of The Mystery Men, and a wonderful, wonderful movie from 26 years ago now. And of course, the creator of the Flaming Carrot universe, the one and only Bob Burden. Yay, Bob! Last but certainly not least, the man I've already mentioned, my buddy and compadre, Phil the Thrill Nelson. Phil is currently created a horror comic called Axicab, where it's a cab that kills people, and it's wonderful. It's on many layers. I know it sounds kind of like a slasher film, but it's a slasher film with heart. So
There is no heart. The only hearts are laying on the ground.
Yes. Let's get started with our topic at hand. How did The Flash save the comic book industry? Well, we have to go all the way back to 1955, when there were massive layoffs at most comic companies. A lot of this, of course, had to do with that scourge of comics, Frederick Wortham,
Right.
and that bastard. And so comics had, they were hit with a double whammy. Television had just shown up, and so people were not reading as many comics, they were watching television. So that was one thing. But then, of course, the maligning of the comic book industry didn't help either.
Bill, I actually read that book cover to cover.
Yeah.
It's as insane as you think it would be.
Oh, yes.
Seduction of the Innocent.
yeah, it's nuts. And so you had this period where they were basically coming out of the golden age and into what would become known as the silver age. Well, they were trying to think at DC, how can we reinvent the wheel? And then someone had the wonderful idea. Who was it?
They don't know.
Well,
That is the big mystery, and we'll talk a little bit about who was in this meeting, this editorial meeting, in a little while.
Right.
But somebody, and nobody ever came up and took credit for it. It was most likely it was a collaborative effort between the gentlemen in that meeting.
Yeah.
But somebody decided to give the Flash another try, and Julie Schwartz said that they all derided him and said, no, the Flash won't work. He failed in 1950. We had to cancel his comic. But Julie said that he stood up and said, you know what? It's been enough years. We're going to have a new audience of kids, and I think they'll take a fresh look at the Flash.
Right.
So,
But the U-turn that they made from previous comics is they actually tried to make this a realistic hero, a hero that wasn't like jeepers, golly, and all that crap. It was people actually going on a first date, people working in a serious industry, crime solving. You had all these elements coming out, and you had a character that was kind of evolving on its own. And they went, well, we have this showcase series where we don't have to give him his own title yet. We can see if people like the character, and we'll see where it goes. Well, Mike, you want to take it up from there?
well, yeah, just to take a step back, there's a basic graph right there of where comic book sales were. The data is extremely sketchy. So when you look at this graph, generally you can see the trend, right?
Yes.
So it's not exact. We had about 65 publishers. And we're down to about 25 in 1956. So things were looking rough.
right. And something to be aware of is comics were trying to compete with television. And so when you can be graphic with horror comics, when you can be sexy with the romance stuff, put the crime stuff in there and show people die, make those covers gruesome, you're going to attract people at the newsstand, and people will buy it. But after the comics code, they couldn't do that stuff, and so now they have a hard time competing with TV, and TV's just a lot more interesting. There's going to be more violence in movies, so it was hard. And to kind of piggyback on what Bill said, that relatability, I think as an editor, Julia Schwartz was like, how are we going to compete? These sales are coming down. Erwin Donenfeld is at the meeting. Julia Schwartz is at the meeting. It's a creative meeting. What are we going to do in the rising tide of some anti-comic book feelings, and also the failure of other genres that they played. They were doing a lot of Robin Hood stuff and Knights, and that just wasn't selling. It wasn't saving them. So they needed something. They need something unique and different.
Kevin, I know you know quite a bit about this era. What would you have to add to that?
Well, I would say that one thing that people today don't think about as much when we think about comics, especially from that time, is that most of the stuff being published was, like you said, crime, horror, but also romance, humor, funny animals. Those were the majority of it. By the early 50s, superheroes were basically disappearing.
Right.
There's very, very few capes and costumes on the stands.
Right. DC only had the three main ones left
And
in the early 50s.
Yeah, and Marvel tried to do a couple with like Marvel Boy and Venus, tried to bring a few in. They only lasted a handful of issues each, but they were like, we could try to do superheroes again, and then we'd go back to doing westerns and stuff.
Right.
So they were searching for a new genre, and so the new genre was actually the first genre.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't really new, but it was adding. So there's the idealistic superhero of the 40s, right? So we have that. But then, how are you going to make those interesting? And I think Julia Schwartz, as a very wise editor, he had experience reading a lot of science fiction pulps with Mort Weisinger and amazing stories and whatnot. And what made that science fiction interesting to him and what made TV at the time interesting was relatability, the relatability of the average person. How would the average person react to having those powers? Let's bring science fiction explanations. Let's try to make the science fiction a little more relatable, more interesting, something that you could wrap your head around. Quantum mechanics was there for a couple decades. Try to throw that into the Flash somehow. Stuff that was a little more real in comparison to like the Golden Age Flash, inhaling hard water and now running fast.
Don't try that at home,
Don't
kids.
try that at home. And smoking cigarettes or something at the time during a smoking break or something.
Yeah, smoking break.
So having that interesting science fiction that we as science fiction fans add that realistic science fiction, relatability of the everyday person, add that now to the superhero formula. And that's basically what they're doing with this Flash issue. And Julia Schwartz is the master editor overseeing everybody working on it.
And just to give it a little extra context, historical, like Alex would say, we have to go back even further. Julie and Mort, they were sci-fi readers and buffs, and they eked out a living for a while in the 30s, from 34 to 44.
Yeah.
And where they were actually, well, Julie was an agent. They started this literary agency for up-and-coming sci-fi writers to get them into the pulps. They were really successful for a while.
Yeah.
But then the pulps kind of dried up in the 40s. And Mort went on to be an editor of a pulp. But both of them ended up at DC Comics, at some point around 1944, due to the industry that they were working in kind of dwindled. They weren't selling enough pulp material to make a living. So keep that in mind in context, because that comes back to that famous meeting sometime in July or sometime in 1955 or early 56 when they came up with this idea.
Bob Burden, on top of being a wonderful creative, he also knows quite a bit about the old school comics. Bob, do you have first memories of the Silver Age Flash?
Well, I was actually there. I mean, believe me, it's kind of dating me, but I wasn't there in 1955, but 65 and 66 and 68. And I was also collecting old comics back then. And one of the things that was really interesting about that, I'm just thinking about it now as I'm listening to you guys, is that there was a different ambiance as far as science fiction and that whole genre of the science fiction and fantasy. And what it was the comic books before the Flash were more focused on entertaining kids, whereas the later, from the Flash on into the early 60s, there was sort of an interest in scientific underpinnings to things like gamma rays and with the space race that was going on at the time, there was an interest in real science, actual science, rather than fantasy ray guns that would turn you into a bowl of Jello or a hyena or something like that. There was a certain amount of this kind of feeling that things were based in real science, and the kids at that time, at that young, were suddenly all of a sudden more susceptible, more interested in that type of approach to superheroes, science fiction, superpowers, and that type of stuff. Yeah. So, and Julie Schwartz was a good friend of mine for years. We, were kind of wingmen at the conventions. He was a great icebreaker. Although for some reason he was not the handsomest man, but he had a charming personality, and all the girls loved him. And also, I knew Forey Ackerman pretty well, and they came from that era of Ray Bradbury, Robert Bloch, science fiction people. They were at the first. I remember I was at a Chicago show, and a guy came along and he sold me this convention book for the 1939 and 1940 science fiction conventions. One was in New York and one was in Chicago. And all these guys were there, and I had them all autograph it for me because I knew them all, which was really cool. But that invasion of the whole idea of Spider-Man being able to have these spider powers because he's bit by a radioactive spider, the scientific underpinning to it made it more palatable, and people were more able to, the kids were more able to adapt to it. Yeah. Still kind of remedial, but that had a big factor. And so and also if you look at science fiction at the time, things were changing too. You have like Philip K. Dick coming along, right? People like that.
A little more
doing,
deconstruction.
The other side of science fiction that's more ominous and stuff.
Phil also knows quite a bit about comics. That's why he decided to open a comic store. Well, no, that was actually because your wife wouldn't let you have a man cave, so you figured you'd have a man store.
No, what happened is I told her I wanted to open a comic shop, and she said, "Does this mean they're not going to be at our house?" And I said, "Yes." She goes, "I love this idea so much."
Works for me. Yes.
I
Yeah.
have like a couple hundred long boxes, so she was so thrilled.
Yeah, and then we bought recently, not too long ago, we bought 60,000 comics. So we have 6 pallets of which we've only gone through maybe a third. 5 months later now, but yeah, we have comics at Nelco. So come to San Antonio and see us. But Phil, you're more a Marvel guy than a DC guy, but you like everything. What do you remember about the Flash? Early thoughts.
Bill, don't paint me into that corner.
I know.
It's
You
a
love
tough
everything.
crowd. No, I've always been a Flash fan, and it goes back to what Bob said. I felt like Flash is a guy that I could be.
Yeah,
If I was
That's the whole
working
thing.
with the right chemicals and lightning hit me, I could be the Flash. And I loved back as a kid. I loved the whole Flash Superman concept of who's fastest. And
Yeah.
there were so many events around the Flash that were iconic in comic book history. And I know you've got an outline and a timeline, but even in the 80s when Mike Barron and those guys revitalized the Flash, I loved the Flash as a kid. I lost interest in the Flash as an older kid, and then that series brought me hardcore back in.
Yeah.
Bill, what's the question?
But you answered it. But
My ADD kicks in. I'm like, squirrel.
so the Flash takes off relatively quick, the character and the series, and you have 4 showcase appearances, and then within 2 years they decide we'll restart the numbering with 105, which the golden. And I always thought, Mike, that how confusing would that be? Shouldn't they have just started back over like they did with Green Lantern, with Adam? Do you think 105 was a good idea, or do you think it was a misstep?
Well, Julie talked it over. I think he was talking with Whitney Ellsworth about it, about the numbering. And numbering can be really tricky with the distributors. It was often believed that number ones back in the day, believe it or not, did not really sell well. And that kids who were reluctant to give their dimes away for these comics that we all love were more apt, if it was a title they weren't familiar with, and this was the thinking. I don't know if they did any market research, but this was the thinking that they would rather go with a title that was more established, because, if it was a brand new one, they'd
And a higher number.
Marvel did the same thing, though, following Flash's example. When they tried to bring back Captain America and Namor and Human Torch, they continued the numbering from the 40s. So it didn't work like the Flash worked, but, they tried.
So they decided to start at 105, which is cool. And if you'll take a look at this slide here, it's really near and dear to my heart. On your left is Flash 103. That one had the same creative team that would do virtually all the Silver Age Flashes.
John Broome.
John Broome and Carmine Infantino. That is the last time Flash appeared on his own comic. He used to share the cover with Hawkman. Every other issue was Hawkman. But that was the last time he appeared on the cover of Flash Comics for quite a while, about 6, almost 7 years. And so I just thought how prescient it was. And also the name of the story is The Sword of Time. And incidentally, the story really doesn't have the connotations that it comes to mind. Like, is he reaching out into the future? No, it's about something else. But nonetheless, it's a really good visual. It's a really good visual of Flash reaching maybe perhaps forward into time. And then, of course, in 56, we get Showcase number 4. And there's the Showcase titles. One thing to note about the Showcase titles, it was so cool what they did because they could not know, they didn't know right away the sales. You want to talk a little bit about that, Alex?
Well, Showcase was a tryout title, so they would try all sorts of different new concepts and characters. A lot of the new Silver Age stuff that we've read starts in Showcase, and So then, and it would take 4 months to get sales on one title or on one issue that came out. So they would have to do a few of them, and then once they would show blips later, then they realized, well, this is a viable character. We can use this in the market, and the company can rely on it as a reliable source of income. So let's put our fish in that basket. It should, the art is great. Carmine Infantino takes this huge leap forward between the two types, but a lot of this was really quite writer driven too. I think Julia Schwartz was very much into the writers. Robert Kanigher wrote that first story, that whole relatable everyday guy, getting that weird science fiction thing and his experiences. And John Broome takes over a lot of that writing, and there was just something where everyone was just on that same page with Julia Schwartz, and you can see it in these showcase covers. You just see that you're really just rocking and rolling now. Each cover is doing something interesting with time and space and all sorts of interesting things that it feels like a little mini renaissance happening on those showcase covers. It's such a beautiful, unique thing to look at.
Yeah, especially when you look at them all together like that. And if you're fortunate to have those in your collection, that's amazing.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so the showcase was where they tried it out. And a lot of the writers that Julie brought over were from the pulps, like John Broome was a client of his. Bob Kanigher, I think, too.
But Kanigher himself was a very unique and creative guy.
Look what else happened. Showcase is going gangbusters. They say, Julie, what else can we do? You've got a hit going. Sales are up after being down. Who wants to take the Green Lantern one?
Well, before you go there, the title of our panel, as everyone knows, is How Flash Saved Comic Books, right?
Yes.
Or comics. And so it is interesting that experiment with Flash showed that superheroes could be relevant and thrive. And then it leads into everything you have on that slide, because it's interesting when you capture lightning in a bottle, and that's what they did. Since Flash has lightning, I had to say that. That was really lame. I'm so
done.
sorry.
That was a good one, Phil. That was really good.
Perfect.
But I mean, it did. It showed that those superheroes, that people wanted them.
Yeah.
And before that, like y'all mentioned earlier, it was romance, westerns, all these other genres, and superheroes were lame to everybody. And now all of a sudden, superheroes are cool.
Yeah.
I also want to point out that the costume they put the Flash in was just so modern. There had been obviously some other costumes like that in the 40s, like Captain America, but a lot of the 40s ones were either haphazard, like Jay Garrick or Alan Scott, or they were just wearing shorts with no pants, which was a very, very common thing. People think that Namor is like a weird outlier, but no, many heroes in the 40s look like that. But if you look at Flash, Barry Allen, and then we got Hal Jordan, and we got the Atom, and we have these really, there's no capes. You know, they're very modern looking for the
Sleek,
time.
very sleek.
And I think that helped sell it a lot, getting people past the cover, and then the relatable stories kept them reading.
Yeah, and each one is the Atom and White Dwarf, Star Matter, scientist, and he's but he's a scientist, but a relatable one, and exploring his powers through that. And then Hal Jordan, it's a retcon of the Golden Age Green Lantern, but again, it's science fiction driven, using a lot of the science fiction stories from the Gray Lensman pulp series, but bringing the space cop idea. Even Hawkman and Hawkgirl, which is not here, is also retconned, where they're Thanagarian aliens instead of the whole reincarnation Egypt thing that they did in the Golden Age. So again, it's just a science fiction boom going on in comic books now at this point.
But if you think about it too, let's harken back to the Golden Age for a second. You had a Green Lantern who could be clobbered by anything wood. You had the Atom, who was a short guy who was strong. And then what they did was they took just the name and they completely rebooted based on more realism. People were really into it. They were getting an older fan base too, which that played into so many different things. And so you have this, then you leap. After you've created all these characters, you leap into them bringing back in Brave and the Bold the Justice League. And then the Justice League became even a bigger hit than all the other. Right. Because kids, believe it or not, and I thought this as a kid, I came up a little later, but kids were very budget conscious. And Justice League offered you not one, not two, not three, but 6 superheroes for the price of one. And I still believe that that had a lot to do with the catalyst of Justice League being so popular right out of the gate. Well, it took like 2 seconds for Martin Goodman to go, Stan, this is working for them. Why don't we do this?
Yeah.
And so Stan and Jack together, of course. And we're not going to get into any Stan bashing today, but as far as I know, you had them almost instantly create a comic that harkened back to so many different things.
You know, they're not Marvel at this point, but it's in the Atlas era. They're doing the other genres. They're doing space stuff, mysterious stuff, westerns, romance, and it's the same old thing. And Martin Goodman is a genre chaser, right? So he would look at the sales and be like, hey, Cowboys are doing good this month. Let's do 20 of those.
Martin Goodman, the guy that basically founded, what became Marvel later on, genre chaser is like the best way to put it.
Yeah, genre chaser is what he was.
I feel like
It's the nicest way to put
Yeah,
it.
I feel like the reason he went from pulps to superheroes in the 40s was because, hey, they're making money off.
That's right.
Superman.
It's just he's definitely not a pioneer. But he follows it in the right way.
And he follows it well.
He follows it well.
But so many of the things at Marvel, and Alex, I know you've looked at the stats a bit more than I have, that they were not selling well. Like they were able to keep afloat with the westerns and the romance. And
Yeah, I think just purely by volume.
but nothing. Yeah, exactly. Nothing like the Superman or Wonder Woman that were
Right.
actually selling.
Yeah, and Martin Goodman had a lot of different corporations. It wasn't just one corporation, so he could play with losses and gains and not pay taxes on a lot of the money. So he was able to keep it alive, pretty well doing things like that.
Yeah, and then like I said, Marvel tried in the 50s to have a revival of superheroes. They wanted to copy what DC was doing with bringing Captain America back and Human Torch back and Namor, but that, except for Namor, they only lasted about like 5 issues each. Namor lasted 11 issues.
Yeah, Bill Everett. It was beautiful issues though.
That's some of his best work.
Yeah, it's some of the best he did.
You had them bringing in the only 2 guys that really remained after they got rid of most of the artists were the wonderful Joe Maneely and Matt Baker. And the thing about that was that
Atlas Implosion.
tragedy struck because both of those guys died in the same year, 1958. And Joe by a tragic subway accident. And then how did Matt Baker die?
He's a heart attack.
It was a heart attack.
Okay.
And I think Joe Maneely actually fell between the steps in the train.
Yeah.
On the commute back home or something.
Right. And so
So
then
sad.
there's a sudden void of talent.
Right.
So they go and they basically get Kirby, who is really pissed off at DC at the time because of
the Sky Masters,
Sky Masters.
comic book strip. So you can see how all these things are kind of coming together, right? DC is on a roll. Marvel is going to follow. Well, they're not Marvel yet; they're Atlas, but Marvel's is not far behind. But their shop is in shambles right now. Their 2 most creative artists just died within a year of each other.
And also there was a distribution collapse, right? Because the Atlas implosion, where Martin Goodman was distributing all his own comics, and he found a better deal with American News Corporation. They went out of business. They had a big trust lawsuit or big lawsuits and issues with the feds were looking at them, so they that didn't work out. So he had to have DC distribute his stuff, and they said we'll only do 16 monthly titles. So it really contracted his comics from 80 a month or so to 16. So it was all kind of primed for a new beginning. I think what they're saying with Jack Kirby is he was over at DC Comics. He was actually doing the Silver Age Green Arrow. He was doing Green Arrow over there and a couple other
Challengers of the Unknown.
Challengers of the Unknown. So he was doing stuff there, but he fell into some royalties dispute with their editor over a newspaper strip they worked on. He got blackballed from DC, and so then he went back to Marvel to work there where they needed talent. There was a vacuum, and they didn't know what they were going to do. And then Steve Ditko also comes in from Pennsylvania to start working. He's doing experimental, almost like Hitchcock type material for Charlton Comics, and Stan saw talent there. So there's something there where now they're in dire straits. You got a veteran, you got Stan, and then you got Steve Ditko coming in with this completely left field stuff. So what's going to happen in all this? And then you have a directive from Martin Goodman saying, hey, let's chase this superhero, Well, now they can do something unique and different. Now you can start fresh with something new.
Before I change this slide, I just want to say that picture of Steve Ditko. You guys like that one?
I was going to ask where that came from.
When I saw it, I was like, I got to use it. Anyway, I hadn't seen it before, so I didn't know if you
Steve Ditko famously did not like having his picture taken.
I know, I found that one. I dug it up just for Con.
So then you have this new comic that Martin has basically told Stan he had to do. At the same time, you had Stan wanting to get out of the comic industry and basically saying, you know what, to his wife, I'm going to throw a Hail Mary. I'm going to do the comic book I've always wanted to do. I'm going to make it realistic, and it's my Hail Mary. If it doesn't make it, if it doesn't connect, well, then all I can say is at least I tried. Well, I mean, come on. Do we have some Fantastic Four fans in the audience? Okay. My favorite comic book of all time.
I keep hoping one of these days they'll get a movie.
Yeah, but they never get it right. That's the problem.
If they ever do get it right, I'm going to get tickets and I'll be there.
Yeah, me too. Man,
might
well, we can
might
dream
be tonight or tomorrow.
for 12 hours. But so yeah, so what the Fantastic Four did was it played on all of these things we've already explained to you about the Flash and how the realism came back in it. You had these people that were neurotic as hell. You had
right.
and I think the neurotic factor probably helped comics come back stronger more than anything else, because after the Fantastic Four, of course, you had this kid character who actually, because he was a dumbass, got his uncle killed, and right after he'd been bitten by a radioactive spider, tried to be a wrestler.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, all these things are things that could kind of maybe happen if we lived in a universe.
Exactly. Who among us could say we
radioactive
haven't
spiders?
tried to be a wrestler at one point or time?
I know. But he was actually a luchador, if you think about it, because he was a masked wrestler.
Fully masked.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Spider door. But
Something to add on to that is the relatable science fiction stuff. Yeah, these comics had that too. They chased that. But then they added what Bill is referring to, anxiety, like massive amounts of anxiety. Throw anxiety on top of that, and now you have the Marvel superheroes. And that does add a certain special thing. And I'm curious about Bob Burden, and how did you feel when that stuff was happening?
One of the things I think probably that affected me when I was looking at the early comic books was the artwork, and in particular with the choice of Carmen Infantino for the Flash. This was a whole new revolution just from the kinetic look of it, the iconic look of it. It was a evolution. It was a step up. And one of the other things I think that kind of comes in there is the early superheroes were almost like deities. They were almost like the Roman or the Greek gods, that were above everybody else. And then when DC and Marvel, particularly with somebody like Spider-Man, began bringing in this new revisionist genre of superheroes, characters were more, say, like Ulysses, and Ulysses was a guy that the gods would tamper with and mess around with and stuff like that. And the other thing was that with somebody like Carmen Infantino drawing it, it had this sort of realism that was like, Outer Limits. The first episode of Outer Limits was fascinating because, and it was kind of along the same type of genre where all of a sudden the psychology of science fiction was evolving and people were looking at it totally differently, and it was maturing. And then I kind of screwed the pooch when I came up with this thing called the Mystery Men, where it was no longer the upper class superheroes, the middle class superheroes. Spider-Man was a middle class guy. I lived in the suburbs and this, that, and the other thing. And then I came up with these characters that were like blue collar Milltown superheroes that, had, male pattern baldness and needed arch support and, had.
And a shovel.
A shovel. Two ex-wives chasing around, so.
Two ex-wives.
Yes.
Then, of course, everything starts parlaying here. You had a 6-issue run of the Hulk. The Hulk was basically cut along the same lines of the cloth. But the Hulk was created because Martin Goodman said, Frankenstein is really selling. Let's have a green, mean green. I went to North Texas, so I can say mean green, but a mean green superhero who, doesn't take shit. Well, the problem with that is the first issue, he's gray. And he gets so mad at Stan, he goes, how does this look like Frankenstein? Well, he's a little grayer than green, but I don't know. It looks like Frankenstein to me. And so issue 2, you have a kind of a rebooted Hulk already, and he's green, and he stays green until he isn't green, and then he's gray again, he's red again, red for the first time, blue. I mean, you really have every color of the Hulk you can think of. I don't think they've done a translucent Hulk, but
they need to.
They do.
There was a blue Hulk in 1998. The people overlook that, but there was a blue Hulk before there was a red Hulk.
Was that a printing error?
No,
just kidding.
They made him an Atlantean, so he got to swim. But what's
smart.
funny? It's talking about all the science. The one Marvel book that didn't have science in that way was Thor, but in the actions he was doing, there was going to be antimatter as he's doing that with Loki, and also the fact that he's more flawed, kind of like the post-Flash heroes were going to be more flawed, where he walks with a limp, for example.
Yeah. And also, he wasn't really like the original Thor at first.
Yeah.
He was Donald Blake.
He was a flawed person.
He had the
taking
power
on the
of
powers
Thor.
God. Yeah.
So that they changed that somewhere in the middle.
But you had all of these factors, and then DC starts trying to be more like Marvel, and I don't know, it got so confusing. And then you had Steve Ditko leave Marvel because he had been told he was going to get a lot more money for doing Spider-Man, so he goes back to making like $25 a page at Charlton, and then DC kind of steals him, and he comes up with even more neurotic characters like Hawk and Dove. And Phil, right. I think you can speak to this because you're a big Ditko fan. Why didn't Hawk and Dove succeed where Spider-Man did?
They're not as good.
Okay, thank you for that
Very,
technical
very
analysis,
simple. I mean,
Phil.
Hawk and Dove's fun, but it's not Spider-Man. But, I want to derail for just a second and I would like to kind of hear what you guys have to think. But, I think one of the big shifts with the Silver Age Flash was the way they handled villains. Because, it's not a silly monster. It's interesting people that have a story, and I would just like to hear y'all's thoughts on how the approach towards villains in the Flash books in those early Silver Age DCs also saved comics.
What I think is really important is that while villains had origins, often they were always just like, an origin, villain, never see them again. And if you do, they don't reference that at all. Flash, really, especially with Barry Allen, really brought in that rogues gallery.
They really did.
Where you have returning villains and returning that. So, a lot of people think of Batman's rogues gallery. A lot of those characters did not show up a lot before the 60s. It wasn't until after the TV show that they started coming back on a regular basis.
A few did, like the Joker and Harvey Dent. A few, Hugo Strange made a few appearances. And I would like to say, most of the Batman villains were created by this guy named Bill Finger, and his granddaughter Athena happens to be sitting in the front row.
Yay!
And that guy kind of did good
You should have a
villains.
panel about Bill Finger and his influence.
Yes, Alex's panel, by the way, and that's going to be on Saturday. So
Saturday, 10 a.m.
please come
Yep.
see it. And
Room
we're
4.
We're going to have a lot of ne'er-do-wells on that panel. Lenny Schwartz. Who else is on that panel? You, me, Athena, and am I leaving? No, that's
Mark Evanier.
And Mark Evanier. Yeah, Mark. Oh, 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. 10-minute
We
warning.
have 13 slides remaining.
Yeah, no, 74 actually.
I can help you.
Go
wrap it
through
up
him in
if
a
you
flash.
But
Thank you,
talking
smart
about
person.
as far as the Flash villains, though, something about those villains is each one plays with a different physics concept too.
Captain
Right.
Cold,
Yeah.
Mirror Man.
Right.
Heat Wave, Captain
Yeah.
Cold, Gorilla Grodd, which was another big seller. The Gorilla, the Gorilla
gorillas on the
covers.
cover.
If you guys-
That's what was cool about the Flash. It was like physics exercises. I mean, that was such an interesting thing. That's more unique to the Flash, really. And if he oscillates his resonant frequency, he'll end up in a different alternate reality. Like, that's crazy stuff. It kind of makes sense in a weird way.
You could tell they were really having fun with the whole concept. And eventually Julie thought, well, maybe I could mine some more Golden Age characters and he could vibrate into another parallel universe where all the Golden Age characters still exist. So that was really fun. And of course, they went and did that and created the whole
not only
multiverse genre.
That was even another huge shift if you think about it, because then they're referencing that we're a different universe than those guys from 10 years ago. And then they keep finding more and more universes with tweaked character versions in different universe. And then you eventually get to the 80s and you have Crisis, where they try to break it all down and say, we don't have all these universes anymore. They all live in the same town almost. I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous.
So for better or for worse, without Flash, you would not have the multiverse concept.
That's exactly what I was gonna say.
Exactly.
So everybody here who says, you've had too much multiverse, it's Barry Allen's fault.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and they started it all. But the thing is that this kind of creative spark that they had in this fateful meeting, we don't know exactly who was in that room. We don't know exactly what day it was, but sometime in 55 or 56.
We do know heroin was involved, strangely enough. I'm not quite
That's
sure
not true.
why, but no, I kid.
She needed to be saved.
Yeah, they need to be saved. I don't even know why I said that.
Coffee. It was coffee.
So-
It's coffee. Really good coffee.
So
From
like
Colombia.
this whole thing, they came up with this idea. It took them a couple of years to really get it going and have Flash with his own book. But they were getting sales results from Showcase. They really saved their own jobs and they saved the industry. And had they not done that, and I think Alex would, probably concur, what would have happened to Marvel? Of course, everybody loves Marvel. And, Marvel has done so well for comic books in the industry over the last 30 years or so. But if these guys at DC hadn't come up with this idea, none of that probably would have happened. It would have been a very strange alternate universe indeed, right?
Yeah.
Right. If Jack Kirby hadn't gone to Marvel, and if Stan wasn't the editor, and if Ditko wasn't there to basically explore his vocation.
If Goodman hadn't given him the green light and come up with a superhero team of your own, Stan, and try that out,
Right.
we probably wouldn't be here, actually.
In the last few minutes we have left, and I see some really great people in the audience. I think you must have thought this was a different panel or something. I see Ward Sutton over there, a good friend of mine from Facebook. Hey, Ward, how's it going? Wonderful cartoonist in his own right. And Camden Spees over here. And so if anybody has any questions about what we've been talking about, please, by all means, raise your hand. Yes, sir, in the front row.
The Atom is interesting because Ray Palmer, the Atom, is named after one of Julius Schwartz's fellow science fiction writing friends from the 30s. They did fanzines and stuff together, and he was a little guy himself. So I think that's Julius Schwartz, pushing something with that.
His own agenda.
In a good agenda.
But I also
I feel that
wonder
way too.
I also wonder if they were trying to reinvent. Maybe you would pick somebody who they have a list of names, what could you do with those names? Everybody was talking about atomic power at that time, and we have a guy called the Atom. Let's just go ahead and use it.
Right.
I think you got a point there. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Eric, you had a question?
And those particle collider experiments that come up with weird things that are very comic book conclusions. Yeah. So this is my book, Fear of Death. Jim Starlin adds the fear of death to these characters. And then Alan Moore adds selfishness to the characters. And then the stuff after tends to then go back and forth. And now writers are basically on somewhere in that scale. And depending on what story they want to tell, they'll put it at one part of that range.
I want to say that earlier we were talking about how they added anxiety to the superheroes, and that definitely defines the heroes of the late 50s and early 60s. But I'm a high school teacher, and all my students read webtoons. And I think all of those webtoons have just taken all that anxiety and just turned it up to 100. So just more anxiety, I think, is what they've been adding to make them popular again.
Yeah. And we know that Goodman was following trends and telling his editor to do stuff. But the golf game, that specific thing,
Sadly, we're officially out of time because we don't have Barry Allen here to take us back an hour to have another hour
need that
to talk
treadmill.
to you guys. But we want to thank you all, and I'd like to thank all the people on the panel for being with us today. And most importantly, we want to thank all you guys for letting us listening to our folly for 50 minutes. But we hope you have a great con, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Flash fans. Thank you.
Before you leave, guys, group photo. We gotta get a group photo.